What is it really like to sail through a war zone in a commercial tanker? Shipping has found itself under fire in the Strait of Hormuz and the Gulf due to the war in Iran. This is not the first time this has happened though, and today you'll be hearing a first-hand account of sailing through the Strait of Hormuz during the Iran-Iraq war, and the harrowing experience of being on board a VLCC that was hit by a missile. Hi, this is Marcus Hand, editor of Seatrade Maritime News, and today's episode features Arjun Vikram Singh, CEO and MD of maritime software specialist Quantum, talking about his time serving on VLCCs during the Iran-Iraq war, and we explore how his experience relates to that faced by seafarers caught up in the current Iran conflict. Welcome to the podcast, Arjun, and could you briefly introduce yourself to our listeners?
Morning, Marcus. I'm really on my third life. I used to be a ship captain, but I put away the captain because it doesn't have much of a place in the commercial world. I worked as C-suite between Noresia and CSAV, and now I run a software company based out of Singapore with the factory in Bangalore.
We're going to go back to that time when you were a seafarer and a ship captain, back to the 1980s, and perhaps if you could talk a little bit about what life was like working as a seafarer back in that period.
You know, those were great days, Marcus. I am a second-generation master mariner, so I sailed a great deal with my father as a child. I went out to sea as a 17-year-old in 1977. And I have to tell you, it was the most wonderful adventure of one's life. It was wide open oceans. There were no electronic gadgets. It was all fundamental of seafaring that the Admiralty had put together. And progressively, I became a very young captain at the age of 28. You know, they say it's not the age, it's the mileage. And that was sea miles. There was a great deal of adventure, pirates, hostilities in different oceans, rough seas. So yes, it was a wonderful phase of my life.
Sounds an incredible experience, actually. And as you mentioned, we're going to focus in on one part of this, and that was working in the Gulf region during the Iran-Iraq war.
It was in the early hours of this morning that Iraqi tanks ground across the border into Iran. The Iraqis' declared aim is to control the Shatt al-Arab waterway, up which ships sail to the Iraqi port of Basra. And this evening they claim to have surrounded the refinery town of Abadan and its port of Khorramshahr.
Can you just explain how you ended up doing that?
Well, you have to appreciate that in 85, 86, there was no internet. Newspapers carried very little of what was happening around the world. Neither did television. The ship management company, Gulfi Ship Management in Hong Kong, when you were standby to go back on a ship, you'd be called and said, you know, we're sending you out over here and you're going on board this kind of ship. Basically, it looked at the operational profile of the ship rather than where you were going to be navigating to or any of the other aspects. So it was March 86. I got called that I was going on board the Caribbean Breeze. And I have to admit, I really did not have a concept of what was happening in the Iran-Iraq war, other than the infrequent newspaper reporting. So it was an adventure. It was just another ship. I was a second officer. I'd never sailed on board a VLCC. This was, I think, about 318,000 tons. And bags were packed, and I was ready to go.
If you're enjoying the Seatrade Maritime podcast, make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing on the app of your choice. Could you describe to our listeners the typical voyage that you would have taken at that point in that region from Cork to Kuwait and back out?
The company had 3 VLCCs that were chartered to the Kuwait Oil Tanker Company. And KOTC did not want their ships going into the Gulf because of the risk. So the Gulfi ships, there were 3 of them. There was the Caribbean Breeze, the Portchester Sky, and the Yucatan Valley, would essentially run up to Mina Al Ahmadi, load cargo over there, and come back down to Corfacan and transfer to the large KOTC tankers. But this journey was fraught with a great deal of risk because when you look at the Persian Gulf, There wasn't a lot of risk when you rounded the Strait of Hormuz. You were on the southern traffic separation scheme and you were much closer to the UAE coast. And also because the ships were in ballast, you were able to stay a lot closer to the UAE coast. So we would typically set out about noon round the Strait of Hormuz, and we would run up to between Dammam and Jubail, and we would anchor over there because we wouldn't sail in daylight in areas that were deemed hostile due to the Iranian aircrafts. And then, as soon as it was night, we would make a dash going up to Mina al Ahmadi, try and get there just about sunrise. This was also a period that we couldn't run our radars. We didn't have DECA or LORAN or satellite navigation. And navigation was typically taking terrestrial navigation off flares. I mean, can you imagine a VLCC, no radar? We would be looking at oil rigs and the flares that the oil rigs had. We would typically be loading in Mina al Ahmadi for about a day, day and a half. But we needed to shut off cargo no later than sunset. So we would be at the outer buoy, which was protected area by Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. And there wasn't a lot of Iraqi Air Force over there. And then we would make a dash down to the Bahrain Light, which was in darkness. There was always an Iranian spotter aircraft, a turboprop aircraft that would come and circle around because there was no AIS signals and stuff like that. So only when this aircraft went around you and spotted you as a target aircraft, and they could only do that in daylight. So we would then sail from the Bahrain Light just before sunrise. But we couldn't come too close to the UAE coast now because we were drawing about 21 meters. And there's a very gradual shelf that runs out from the UAE, and now the ship gets pushed a lot closer to the Iranian coast. This puts you a little bit outside the US protection. There were these escort vessels that were running over there. And that's typically what happened on the Breeze. We came out, we had to move a little further off the shelf. The Caribbean Breeze got overflown by a turboprop aircraft. The captain immediately called in that, listen, I've been overflown by this. And it was just minutes later that a US-made Maverick missile that hit just below the bridge. That was stunning because immediately we shut the engines down. And within minutes, there was a US helicopter over there. There was an Army hospital down. So voyages that ended with nothing, multiple voyages on the Portchester Sky, as an example. There was this one voyage that actually ended with a hit.
Can you describe the actual experience of what happened when that missile hit?
Marcus, if you've been on the bridge of a vessel, you would note that the bridge front windows lean forward a little bit. And they've got these metal struts at about every 3-4 feet. So when the missile impacted on the deck below, it just wiped out the captain's deck. But the impact and the blast actually fragmented the armored glass that went upwards and into the false ceiling and the asbestos layer on the bridge. The bridge puffed up due to the explosion, so it sort of raised up a little bit. The third officer had just got one of the Navy vessels, so he had the walkie-talkie in his hand, and he leaned forward to hand it to the captain. And at that time, one of the bridge struts, the metal struts, actually came out and hit him on his arm, and he nearly lost the arm. On the bridge, I think people were stunned. Nobody could hear much. My best mate, Steve Mitchell, was the chief officer, and I have to say, he very quickly stepped in. There was no fire, or there was very little fire, just on the captain's deck. But essentially, the Breeze lost all navigation equipment, lost the steering, and basically it was a dead ship. So as soon as the momentum ended, the ship anchored in pretty deep water at that point in time. there was an evacuation of the injured. And now came the task of, okay, what are we going to do? How are we going to get out of here? It was a relay between the bridge to the engine room with walkie-talkies to get engine movements. Large VLCCs don't have motor engines. They have steam turbines. So the steam turbine needs to very slowly come up to RPM. And steering was a real problem. On all ships, you have a steering mechanism in the steering flat, which is right at the tail, just above the rudder. So communications needed to go down to the steering flat, starboard 5, starboard 10, and it was very, very slow steam. And it was progressively to come out very slowly out of the Gulf down to Khor. The amazing thing in all this was that while we had an escort when we were coming out, no US Navy vessel or an escort vessel, and there were many frigates and corvettes, etc., actually intercepted the incoming aircraft, because apparently, and I don't know this for a fact, that instructions were do not engage unless you are under threat. And that really takes you back to that, we sailed in good faith. We had a sense of security that there were naval vessels around. But it appeared that the naval vessels may have been window dressing rather than somebody that was actually going to build a barricade and a barrier to protect the tankers coming out.
So you kind of had a false sense of security then.
Well, Caribbean Breeze was just one of our ships that got hit. There was another ship called the Five Streams that got hit. There were other ships that were on the later chartered to the National Iranian Tanker Corporation, NITC, and ships got hit over there. In my recollection, we never had a briefing to tell us what the defensive mechanism was. And in hindsight, foolish and very, very naive of us to actually place our faith just on a hull of 300 and some meters long and faith in God that we're going to be okay.
Yeah, thankfully you were okay.
Well, some of my best mates weren't, and that remains a deep regret.
How many times did you make this voyage? It sounds like it was quite a regular thing.
I did 3 voyages on the Porchester Sky. That was the primary running that I did. The Porchester Sky was a very good vessel. The captain was a guy called Captain Naeem Siddiqui, a very competent master. There's an old friend of mine, Danish Sultan, who runs a company in Singapore, who was the 3rd officer. And I was still the 2nd mate on board till I transferred back out to the Caribbean Breeze. But I think adrenaline used to be very high, and we were always very focused on making the next waypoint because that was the safe area. We knew we were running a gauntlet between point A and point B. So all these voyages were really about you finish your cargo in Khor, clean up, and you start running. And then you had to make those milestones. I think going up, there was very little threat. The threat was really in coming down. If you talk to anybody who runs in high stress environments, very often what happens is you insulate yourself from the threat and you focus only on the task that is at hand. And I think if I look back, that was really how, I wouldn't say we survived, I would say we coped. There was a job to be done. It was go between A and B, get there before it got dark, anchor and wait.
With the benefit of hindsight, and you look back on this, would you have taken this role on if you'd understood the dangers you were going to face?
There's 2 parts to your answer. One is, had anybody actually briefed us on the risk, the consequence, and the likelihood of it happening? I may have been young, 23 years old, 24 years old, into adventure. I would have thought that my family would have put their foot down, and my new girlfriend, who I married, would probably not have let me do it. The second part of this, Marcus, is that I'm 65 years old today. I've had a wonderful life thereafter. And if I were to look back on it, and I would say, would I compromise my family, my career, my children, all the good things that I've experienced for this sense of adventure? No.
If you look at today and the ships that are stranded in the Gulf and those that are starting to make transits, do the crew have a lot more knowledge of the situation because we have things like social media, the videos that we see of attacks and all these sorts of things? Does that change things from how it was in your day?
That's a really sad part of our discussion, Marcus, because yes, they know exactly what's going on. There's internet on all the ships. They see what's happening. And they see themselves perhaps as ducks in a pond where it's somebody else's war, but these guys are collateral and they're waiting for that collateral to be converted to damage. I think the big issue of stress lies with the ship's command. The captain isn't just one of 22 or 25 or 30 people on board. He's the guy who has to, at the end of the day, when the owners or charterers or operators say sail out, and he doesn't have much of a choice. The captain carries a very, very big burden at these times. And, the maritime world has become an environment. You see that on container ships as well. Captains really can't say no. He gets an instruction to say, sail. His only choice is to say, I'm not sailing, sign me off. And loyalty to your crew, loyalty to your command. This is something that doesn't happen very often because we don't go down with our ship any longer, Marcus, but we feel a tremendous loyalty for our ship. So if you had a shipmaster today, gas carrier, tanker, container ship, and he's being told sail out. Now, there are ships that are sailing over the north through Larak, and there are ships that are running the gauntlet through the south. That's a very, very big strain, pressure that the ship's command carries.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine how much stress that would be. If you go back to your time, did the captain have that same kind of thing that he could have said no? Or is he, as you say, it's that connection with the crew and so forth in the ship that drives them?
I think the connection with the crew was perhaps stronger than it is now. People always got together in the smoke room, had a beer, played table tennis, whatever else. Everybody knew about the background of everybody's families. There was much more cohesion as a family unit when I was out at sea. Today, people come in, people go out, they change ship managers, so you don't really get to know people. However, at that point in time, the threat was relatively infrequent. It wasn't what you're seeing or they are seeing at the current point in time. Because think about this for a moment. If there is a ship and there are 100 ships anchored outside the UAE, they are seeing these drones and missiles go over their heads every night. Hundreds of them. So you imagine the stress that they're carrying. It's like a chicken being in a coop, and one by one the chickens are being taken out to slaughter, and you're wondering, when is my turn going to come? I don't think any of the ship's complement, masters or juniors, had any inkling that this was a risk that they were taking when they went into the Persian Gulf, because on the 28th of February, the whole world changed. They steamed in, they went to wherever they had to go to load their cargo, and all of a sudden, they reached a barrier and said, you can't go any further. And then these fireworks were every night light up of the sky. Do they have a choice? If I were a master or a junior over there today, I would ask to be relieved. But, that brings back that old sense of bravado. Am I chicken? Am I going to bail out on my mates? One good thing at the current point in time is I think there's a lot more commitment to ensure the safety of a ship on the way out, whether it is by paying this apparent $2 million to exit the Straits of Hormuz. But I think there's a lot more focus on keeping the ship safe, not that they can do it.
So in that sense, the companies have become more responsible in terms of how they operate their ships, or more concerned about the safety of their vessels than they were, say, 30 years ago?
In the days gone by, it was primarily the ship managers, because once you were in the war zone, the insurance premiums were relatively defined and straightforward. I think today it's much more the operator, the cargo interest that has to deal with the insurance companies, because if there is no insurance on hull, crew, and cargo and pollution, then that becomes the main thing, and the ship manager has no role in that. Ship manager's role is only to keep the crew on board and operate the vessel. So there's a paradigm shift over here. At that point in time, KOTC insured the hull and the cargo. At this point in time, it's very different.
If you look at the situation today, and then you look at how you talked about the escorts and so forth, and having to sort of go outwards towards Iranian waters because of the channel depth, is it possible to have safe escorts through that region in the sort of current conflict?
Marcus, look, I'm not a security or warfare expert, but I will tell you that the Strait of Hormuz is very narrow. And separating from 1986 to the current point in time, it's a period of 40 years. The arsenal that is being used is very different. In those days, it was an aircraft, and intercepting an aircraft for anybody or one of the powers in with the air bases in Abu Dhabi or Saudi Arabia, etc., is a lot easier. And reading what we do on social media and in the press, there are no forward airfields from where these planes need to take off. So the moment a plane takes off, you could intercept it. But the arsenal one has to be afraid of today is a small missile that can be on a very high speed boat running at 45 or 50 knots. If one of these boats takes out from one of the coves and the Iranian coast is littered with little inlets and coves, it could intercept and be able to launch a missile in a minute, 5 minutes. And that's too little time for anybody to intercede and prevent this. There are also the huge threat of drones. Nobody's going to send up a Patriot missile to take out a drone that's hugging the ocean to take out or hit a ship. So when you had the Bab el Mandab Straits, or you had the protection forces protecting ships that were going in against the Somali pirates, yes, that was very, very practical, very plausible. You could put armed personnel on board the ship that could protect the vessel. Over here, my personal opinion is it's fraught with extreme risk. And if somebody were to tell me as a ship captain, don't worry, Arjun, we got your back, I wouldn't believe them.
Okay, I think that's a very telling statement, and obviously the type of threat has evolved dramatically over that period since you were serving in that region. Just to sort of wrap this up, I'd like to just sort of bring this more to the current day. Your experiences back in the 80s and what happened to you on the Caribbean Breeze, how has that sort of shaped your life later in your career?
Oh, well, Marcus, that's a very difficult question. I went to a boarding school that was founded in 1847, and our school motto was never give in. We were brought up that you never back down on a challenge. You ran up Tilly's Hill even though your chest is bursting, kind of thing. My own personal DNA has always been to take a challenge. But what I think this taught me a little bit more was to be able to assess risk a little better. I must admit, I've taken chances at different times, bad weather, approaching a port where you want to beat a Delmas vessel coming in and you're a little too fast. But, where it pertains to your own life, that's a different matter. Or when you become a captain in command, I think it taught me to assess risk a lot more and ensure that there was adequate mitigation for the crew that I was responsible for their well being. We all have different experiences that teach us a lesson. This taught me a lesson on my personal safety. Be a little bit more careful, assess risk a little better. And if you have the choice to make a choice that allows you the longevity as opposed to the bravado for just a short period of time.
Thank you, Arjun, for taking the time today to talk about your experiences in the Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz during the 80s and the Iran-Iraq conflict and the sort of wider issues that we see today.
Thank you very much for having me, Marcus, and it's been a pleasure seeing you again.
Thank you for listening to the Seatrade Maritime podcast, and we look forward to joining you on our next episode.